Late at night in Chicago, Attorney General Ava Thompson is wrongly accused of driving a stolen car. As tensions rise and she faces unlawful detention, will she accept an apology or demand justice? Join H2 Black Thread to witness her fight against the system. Like and subscribe for more powerful stories. Ava Thompson, the state's Attorney General, stopped at a downtown Chicago gas station late at night to refuel her car after a demanding day in court. Detectives Samuel Hayes and Officer Rachel Adams approached her, citing a report of a stolen vehicle matching her car's description. They requested her identification and demanded she open her trunk. Ava questioned the legality of the stop, but the officers insisted on proceeding. As Ava stood by her car, the cool night air brushing against her skin, she couldn't help but reflect on the day's events. The courtroom had been a battleground, each case a reminder of the systemic issues she was determined to address. Her mind was a whirlwind of legal arguments and strategies. But now, in the quiet of the gas station, she sought solace in the mundane task of refueling. Detective Hayes and Officer Adams approached with a sense of authority, their badges gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. Hayes, with his broad shoulders and stern demeanor, exuded a presence that commanded attention. Adams, younger and more eager, mirrored his movements, her eyes scanning the surroundings. "Ma'am," Hayes began, his voice firm, "we need to see some ID." Ava's fingers paused on the gas nozzle. She glanced up, already sensing where this was heading. "Routine check," Hayes added, his tone practiced. Ava studied them for a moment. No one else was at the station. No one else was being questioned. Just her. Exhaling slowly, she reached into her purse and handed over her ID. "I'll show you my ID," she said, her voice even. "But first, tell me why you stopped me." Barker stepped forward. "We got a report of a stolen black Lexus in the area. Yours matches the description." Ava almost laughed. She had owned this car for 4 years. The plates were registered in her name, the insurance under her policy. "A stolen car. Who reported it stolen?" she asked. Hayes narrowed his eyes. "Let's not make this difficult," he said. Ava didn't move. She had handled far worse than this: murder trials, federal corruption cases, criminals with everything to lose. But she knew better than to argue in a situation like this. She handed over her ID, keeping her expression neutral as Hayes took it. Barker circled the car, running a hand over the hood like he was inspecting for evidence. "I need you to step away from the vehicle," Hayes ordered. Ava raised an eyebrow. "No," she said. Hayes stepped closer. "Excuse me, you don't have probable cause," she said calmly. "My ID is valid and this car is legally mine. You have no right to search it." A flicker of irritation passed over Hayes's face. He turned toward Barker. "Call it in," he said. This was where things got dangerous. Ava had seen it too many times, how quickly situations like this could spiral. She could hear Barker's voice on the radio, calling dispatch. Her heart pounded, not with fear, but with a sharp, growing frustration. She had worked her entire career to fix this, to hold officers like these accountable. And now, here she was. Hayes folded his arms, watching her like a problem that needed solving. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to step away from the car," he said. Ava didn't move, but she knew this wasn't ending here. "If I refuse?" she asked. Hayes's expression darkened. "Then we'll have to do this the hard way," he said. Ava felt the shift in the air the moment Hayes squared his shoulders. His stance changed, more rigid, more aggressive. She had spent enough time in court dissecting police body language to know what was coming next. "Ma'am, I'm not going to ask you again," Hayes said, his voice tightening. "Step away from the vehicle." Ava's pulse stayed steady. She had argued against men like him in court, picked apart their excuses on the stand. But here, on this dimly lit gas station lot, there was no judge, no jury. Just power unchecked. Barker's hand hovered near his belt. Tension crackled between them. Ava could hear her own heartbeat, steady and deliberate as she calculated her next move. "Sergeant," she said, her voice calm, measured. "You know this is illegal." Hayes exhaled sharply through his nose. "You're resisting a lawful order," he said. "There's nothing lawful about it," Ava countered. She should have known it didn't matter. Barker moved first. His hand shot out, gripping her wrist with a force that told her this wasn't about a traffic stop anymore. This was about control. Before she could react, Hayes grabbed her other arm, wrenching them both behind her back. "Are you serious?" Ava hissed, twisting slightly. "Stop resisting," Barker snapped. She wasn't, but they needed her to be. Ava Thompson stood her ground, her gaze unwavering as Detective Samuel Hayes and Officer Rachel Adams continued their questioning. The cool night air seemed to grow heavier, the tension palpable between them. "I understand your concerns," Ava said, her voice steady, "but I assure you this vehicle is mine, and I have done nothing wrong." Detective Hayes exchanged a brief look with Officer Adams before turning back to Ava. "Ma'am," he began, his tone firm, "we need you to step away from the vehicle." Ava's brow furrowed. "On what grounds?" she inquired, her tone measured. "Failure to comply with a lawful order," Hayes replied, his voice tinged with impatience. Ava's heart rate quickened, but she maintained her composure. "I am not refusing to comply," she stated. "I am asserting my rights. I have done nothing to warrant this treatment." Officer Adams stepped forward, her expression stern. "Ma'am, we are conducting an investigation," she said. "We need you to step away from the vehicle now." Ava took a deep breath, her mind racing. She was well versed in the law and knew her rights, but she also understood the delicate balance required in such situations. "I am not stepping away from my vehicle," Ava replied firmly. Without warning, Detective Hayes moved toward her, his hand reaching for his handcuffs. "You are under arrest for failure to comply," he announced. Ava's eyes widened in disbelief. "This is an unlawful arrest," she asserted, her voice rising. Officer Adams grabbed her arm, pulling it behind her back. "Stop resisting," she commanded. Ava felt the cold metal of the handcuffs snap around her wrists, the pressure biting into her skin. She was being detained without cause, her rights trampled upon. "You have no right to do this," Ava said, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. "You're under arrest," Hayes repeated, his tone final. They guided her toward the squad car, the harsh lights casting long shadows on the pavement. Ava's mind raced, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief. As they reached the vehicle, Officer Adams opened the door and Ava was pushed inside. The door slammed shut, and the world outside seemed to fade away. Inside the squad car, the silence was deafening. Ava sat alone, her wrists aching from the handcuffs, her mind reeling from the events that had just transpired. She had been arrested without cause, detained unlawfully. Her position as the state's attorney general meant nothing in this moment. Ava closed her eyes, taking slow, deliberate breaths. She needed to remain calm, to think clearly. She reached for her phone, but it was gone. They had taken it during the arrest. Her thoughts turned to her assistant, Clara Rodriguez. Clara would be worried, wondering where she was. Ava's mind raced through the possible scenarios. She had been arrested without cause, detained unlawfully. Her position as the state's attorney general meant nothing in this moment. She needed to make a call to inform someone of her situation. But who? The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Ava's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the squad car's engine starting. The vehicle lurched forward, and Ava was thrown back against the seat. She glanced out the window, watching the city lights blur past. She was being taken to the police station, but for what? As the car turned a corner, Ava caught sight of a familiar street sign. They were heading toward the downtown precinct. Ava's heart sank. She had been arrested without cause, detained unlawfully. Her position as the state's attorney general meant nothing in this moment. The squad car pulled into the precinct parking lot, the harsh lights illuminating the area. Ava was escorted inside, her handcuffs clicking with each step. She was led to a holding cell, the door clanging shut behind her. Inside, the cell was cold and sterile, the walls a dull gray. Ava sat on the bench, her mind racing. She had been arrested without cause, detained unlawfully. Her position as the state's attorney general meant nothing in this moment. She needed to make a call, to inform someone of her situation. But who? Prison.Policy.org +2 Polisinjequity.org +2 BJSOJGov +2 The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Ava's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. The door to her cell opened, and a uniformed officer stood in the doorway. "You're free to go," the officer said, his tone neutral. Ava stood, her legs unsteady. The interior of the squad car was stifling, the air thick with tension. Ava Thompson sat in the back, her wrists still aching from the handcuffs, her mind racing. The events of the past hour replayed in her head, each moment more surreal than the last. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a welcome distraction. She retrieved it, noting the caller ID, Clara Rodriguez. Clara was her trusted assistant, the one person who always had her back. "Clara," Ava answered, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "Miss Thompson," Clara's voice crackled through the line, "I've just been informed that the police chief wants to meet with you. He insists it's urgent." Ava's brow furrowed. A meeting with the police chief. This was escalating quickly. "Where is he now?" Ava inquired. "He's at the precinct," Clara replied. "He wants you to come in as soon as possible." Ava glanced out the window, her mind racing. She was already en route to the precinct, but this new development added another layer of complexity. "Understood," Ava said, ending the call. She replaced the phone in her pocket and leaned back against the seat, her thoughts a whirlwind. The police chief wanted to meet with her. Given the circumstances, this could mean one of two things. Either they were acknowledging their mistake or they were preparing to cover it up. As the squad car navigated the city streets, Ava's mind raced through the possibilities. She had been arrested without cause, detained unlawfully. Her position as the state's attorney general meant nothing in this moment. She needed to remain composed, to think clearly. The car pulled into the precinct parking lot, the harsh lights casting long shadows on the pavement. Ava was escorted inside, her handcuffs clicking with each step. She was led to a holding cell, the door clanging shut behind her. Inside, the cell was cold and sterile, the walls a dull gray. Ava sat on the bench, her mind racing. She had been arrested without cause, detained unlawfully. Her position as the state's attorney general meant nothing in this moment. Minutes later, the door to her cell opened, and a uniformed officer stood in the doorway. "Miss Thompson," the officer said, "the police chief is ready to see you now." Ava stood, her legs unsteady. She was escorted down a narrow hallway, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. As they approached the chief's office, Ava's heart rate quickened. She had no idea what to expect. The officer knocked on the door before opening it. "Chief, Miss Thompson is here." Ava stepped inside, her gaze meeting that of Chief Inspector Michael Harris. He was seated behind a large oak desk, his expression unreadable. "Miss Thompson," he began, his voice measured, "I understand you've had an incident with two of my officers." Ava nodded, her expression neutral. "Yes, Chief. I was unlawfully detained by Detective Samuel Hayes and Officer Rachel Adams." Harris leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "I see. And what do you propose we do about this?" Ava met his gaze, her voice steady. "I expect a full investigation into the actions of Detective Hayes and Officer Adams. I also expect them to be held accountable for their misconduct." Harris studied her for a moment before nodding. "Understood. We will conduct a thorough investigation and take appropriate action. Ava stood, her posture rigid. I trust you will. Good day, Chief. She turned and exited the office, the door closing softly behind her. As she walked down the hallway, her mind raced. This was just the beginning. She would not let this incident slide. Back in her office, Ava sat at her desk, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the surface. She had just returned from her meeting with Chief Harris. The conversation had been civil, but she knew better than to take his assurances at face value. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Clara. The press is already getting wind of the incident. We need to prepare a statement. Ava sighed, rubbing her temples. The media frenzy was inevitable. She needed to control the narrative before it spiraled out of control. She composed a response, arrange a press conference for tomorrow morning. I'll need all the details. As she set the phone down, her office door opened and Clara stepped inside, holding a folder. Here are the preliminary reports on the incident, she said, placing the folder on Ava's desk. Ava nodded, flipping open the folder. The reports detailed the events leading up to her arrest, the actions of Detective Hayes and Officer Adams, and the subsequent fallout. It was clear that the officers had overstepped their bounds, but the question remained, why? Clara, Ava said, her voice low, I need you to dig deeper into these officers. Find out if there's a pattern of misconduct. We need to be prepared for whatever comes next. Clara nodded, her expression serious. Understood. I'll get on it right away. As Clara left the office, Ava leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. This was far from over. She would ensure that Detective Hayes and Officer Adams were held accountable for their actions, and she would make sure that the public knew the truth. The following morning, Ava stood at the podium, facing a sea of reporters. The press conference was underway. Good morning, she began, her voice steady. I am here to address the incident that occurred last night involving Detective Samuel Hayes and Officer Rachel Adams. I want to make it clear that their actions were unacceptable and will not be tolerated. She paused, allowing her words to sink in. An internal investigation is underway, and appropriate disciplinary actions will be taken. I will not. Ava Thompson entered the conference room, her steps measured and purposeful. Seated at the polished mahogany table were Police Chief Walter Grayson and Internal Affairs Investigator Samuel Owens. The room was stark, illuminated by the harsh glow of fluorescent lights overhead. Miss Thompson, Chief Grayson began, his voice tinged with a mix of professionalism and unease. Thank you for meeting with us today. Ava nodded curtly, taking a seat across from the two men. Let's get to the point, she said, her tone unwavering. I have evidence of racial profiling and misconduct by Detective Samuel Hayes and Officer Rachel Adams. It's imperative that we address this issue promptly. She slid a folder across the table, its contents meticulously organized. Inside were surveillance footage, witness statements, and records detailing the officer's previous complaints. Grayson perused the documents, his brow furrowing as he absorbed the information. Owens remained silent, his expression unreadable. After a moment, Grayson looked up, his gaze meeting Ava's. This is serious, he acknowledged, but we must consider the potential impact on the department's reputation. Such allegations can undermine public trust. Ava leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. Public trust is built on accountability, Chief. If we allow this behavior to continue unchecked, we risk eroding that trust permanently. Owens interjected, his voice calm yet firm. I agree. An internal investigation is necessary to determine the veracity of these claims and to ensure that any misconduct is addressed appropriately. Ava nodded, her expression resolute. I expect a thorough and transparent investigation. If the allegations are substantiated, I demand that Detective Hayes and Officer Adams be suspended or terminated. There can be no tolerance for such behavior within this department. Grayson sighed, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the table. I understand your position, Miss Thompson. However, we must also consider the broader implications. The department has a history of community engagement, and incidents like this can set us back significantly. Ava's gaze remained unwavering. The broader implication is that we uphold the law and protect the rights of every citizen, regardless of race. Anything less is unacceptable. Owens nodded in agreement. We are committed to conducting a comprehensive investigation. Our goal is to uncover the truth and ensure that justice is served. Ava stood, her posture commanding. I trust you will. I will be monitoring this closely and expect regular updates on the progress of the investigation. As she turned to leave, Grayson spoke once more. Miss Thompson, I hope you understand the complexities involved. We are doing our best to address this matter appropriately. Ava paused, her back still to them. Complexities are no excuse for injustice, she replied, her voice steady. I will hold you accountable. With that, she exited the room, leaving behind two men who were now acutely aware of the gravity of the situation. In the days that followed, Ava remained vigilant, her every action scrutinized by the public and the media. She knew that the path ahead would be fraught with challenges, but she was unwavering in her commitment to justice. The investigation into Detective Hayes and Officer Adams was thorough and exhaustive. Witnesses were interviewed, evidence was analyzed, and the officers' records were meticulously examined. The findings were damning. Both officers had a history of complaints related to racial profiling and excessive use of force. The surveillance footage from the night of Ava's arrest revealed clear evidence of misconduct. Grayson and Owens convened to discuss the findings. The evidence is irrefutable, Owens stated, his voice tinged with frustration. Grayson nodded, his expression grim. We have no choice but to take decisive action. Ava was informed of the decision. Detective Hayes was to be suspended without pay pending termination, and Officer Adams was to be placed on administrative leave, pending further review. The announcement was met with mixed reactions. Some hailed it as a victory for justice, while others criticized the department for not taking stronger action. Ava addressed the media, her voice steady and resolute. This is a step toward restoring trust between law enforcement and the community, she stated. But it is just the beginning. We must continue to work toward a system where every individual is treated with dignity and respect. As she concluded her statement, Ava felt a sense of resolve settle over her. The battle was far from over, but she was prepared to continue the fight for justice. In the weeks that followed, the department implemented new training programs focused on cultural competency and anti-bias education. Community forums were held to foster dialogue between law enforcement and residents. Ava remained at the forefront of these initiatives, her commitment unwavering. She knew that true change required sustained effort and vigilance. As the city began to heal, Ava reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The challenges had been many, but the pursuit of justice had always been her guiding principle. And as she looked toward the future, she knew that the work was far from over. But with each step, she was moving closer to a community where justice and equality were not just ideals, but realities. The courtroom was a sea of faces, each reflecting a spectrum of emotions: anticipation, skepticism, hope. Ava Thompson stood at the front, her gaze steady, her posture unwavering. Today was the culmination of a journey that had begun with a wrongful arrest and had led to this pivotal moment: the prosecution of Detective Samuel Hayes and Officer Rachel Adams for unlawful detention and abuse of power. The prosecution's case, Ava began her opening statement with a voice that resonated throughout the courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "we are here today to seek justice for an individual who was wrongfully detained and subjected to abuse by two officers sworn to protect and serve." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. "This case is not just about one person's ordeal. It is about upholding the principles of justice and accountability that our society holds dear." She outlined the sequence of events leading up to the arrest of her client, emphasizing the lack of probable cause and the subsequent unlawful actions taken by Hayes and Adams. "The evidence will show," she continued, "that these officers acted outside the bounds of the law, driven by bias and a disregard for the rights of the individual they were sworn to protect." Witness testimonies. The first witness called to the stand was Clara Rodriguez, Ava's assistant. Clara recounted the events of that evening, detailing the phone call she received from Ava during the detention. "Ava was calm, but I could hear the tension in her voice," Clara testified. "She mentioned that she was being detained without cause and that the officers were refusing to provide any explanation." Next, the gas station manager, Mr. Thomas, took the stand. He described the surveillance footage he had reviewed, which clearly showed the interaction between Ava and the officers. "There was no indication of any suspicious activity," Mr. Thomas stated. "The officers approached Miss Thompson without any apparent reason and proceeded to detain her." The prosecution also presented expert testimony on police procedures and the legal standards for detention. Dr. Linda Hayes, a criminologist, explained that the officers' actions deviated from standard protocol. "The lack of probable cause and the failure to inform the individual of the reason for detention are clear violations of established procedures," Dr. Hayes testified. The defense's argument in contrast. The defense, led by attorney Mark Davis, argued that Hayes and Adams acted within their rights, citing the need for officers to ensure public safety. "The officers had a duty to investigate any potential threats," Davis argued. "Their actions were in line with their training and the responsibilities entrusted to them." He attempted to discredit the testimonies of the prosecution's witnesses, suggesting that their accounts were influenced by personal biases. "The gas station manager has a vested interest in portraying the officers negatively," Davis claimed, "and Miss Rodriguez's relationship with the plaintiff may color her perception of the events." The jury's deliberation. After closing arguments, the jury retired to deliberate. The room was thick with tension as the 12 jurors sifted through the evidence, the testimonies, and the arguments presented. Hours passed, each minute stretching longer than the last. Finally, the jury returned. The foreperson stood, holding the verdict slip. "We, the jury, find the defendants, Detective Samuel Hayes and Officer Rachel Adams, guilty on all counts of unlawful detention and abuse of power." Ava felt a surge of relief wash over her, tempered by the gravity of the moment. Justice had been served, but the work was far from over. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following week. The courtroom was filled once again, this time with a palpable sense of anticipation. Ava sat in the front row, her hands clasped together, her mind focused on the proceedings. Judge Alina Harris addressed the court. "The actions of the defendants have undermined the trust placed in law enforcement officers," she began. "Such breaches of public trust cannot be tolerated." She turned to Hayes and Adams. "Detective Hayes, you are sentenced to 5 years in state prison for unlawful detention and abuse of power. Officer Adams, you are sentenced to 3 years of probation and 200 hours of community service." The sentences were met with mixed reactions. Some in the courtroom nodded in approval, while others whispered in disbelief. Ava remained composed, her expression neutral. The sentences were a step toward justice, but they were not the end of the journey. Addressing the media after the sentencing, Ava stepped outside the courthouse, where a throng of reporters awaited. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust toward her, and questions were hurled in rapid succession. She raised her hand, signaling for silence. "Today, justice has been served," she began. "But this case is a stark reminder of the work that remains. We must continue to hold law enforcement accountable and ensure that such abuses of power are not repeated." She paused, allowing her words to resonate. This is not just about two officers, it is about a systemic issue that requires our collective attention and action. We must strive for a justice system that is fair, transparent, and free from bias. As she concluded her statement, Ava felt a sense of resolve settle over her. The battle was far from over, but today, a significant victory had been achieved. She turned and walked away, ready to continue the fight for justice.